And we're receiving some breaking news from our producers. Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy is retiring.
Yeah, I
expected
mistakenly
this.
said before that he hadn't because we hadn't heard of any announcements.
Well,
and we thought that they were
didn't
done.
do it from the bench. So we had expected him to retire. The question was, before the court officially ended its term, was he going to retire announce it on the bench? He didn't, but apparently we're getting news from his office that he, in fact, did retire, leaving an opening on the court for President Trump to fill.
Yeah. A lot of people were expecting that he was going to do this. I wonder why they decided to wait and do it the way he did.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know.
You know, maybe we can ask, do we have law school professor Alan Dershowitz? Do we have him there?
Yep.
All right, let's go ahead and go to Harvard Law School professor Alan Dershowitz. He is also a Newsmax contributor, and he's the author of the book, The Case Against Impeaching Trump. Alan, thank you for joining us today. Been looking forward to this. First of all, want to get your reaction to the announcement of this retirement. Are you surprised that he announced it and how he chose to do it?
Well, the manner in which he chose to do it is very common. Usually justices wait for the last day of the term. Sometimes they announce it from the bench to the applause of the other justices. Sometimes they announce it just privately from their office. Everybody expected last year that he would retire, but when Gorsuch was appointed, he was a former law clerk to Justice Kennedy. Justice Kennedy decided he wanted to spend a year with his former law clerk as a colleague. So it was not surprising that he would retire at the end of the year. There were some who thought he might hold on because he's been so influential. He's been the deciding vote in so many cases. And what we're going to see now is an appointment of a very conservative person by the president and a continued politicization of the court. And the court's going to be deciding cases along party lines. And that's not what the framers of the Constitution intended. They intended a court of neutral, nonpartisan justices who were appointed for their expertise in law and their experience as lawyers or lower court judges. But now we have litmus tests on both sides, and we're seeing the court becoming highly politicized and, in my view, somewhat less influential on the way Americans think about the court. I think most Americans have far less respect for the Supreme Court than they used to, and that lack of respect is well deserved by the politicization of the court that I think started with the Bork nomination, and then it continued to Bush versus Gore, and now all these 5-4 votes along party lines.
Now, Professor, Kennedy voted with the conservative majority on the last few, even just this last week, last few major decisions. So had there been a more conservative, what would have changed? Had Kennedy retired last year, what decisions might have been different with a more conservative justice? What might be different going forward?
Well, going forward, it depends on who is picked. It depends on what you mean by conservative. For example, Justice Scalia was very conservative, but he was quite liberal on issues of criminal justice and freedom of speech, issues on which Gorsuch are very, very conservative. So even the movement from Scalia to Gorsuch is a movement dramatically to the right on some important issues. Of course, Justice Kennedy was the deciding vote on the issue of gay marriage and on the issue of the cake baker. Hard to call that a conservative legal split. It really is a split over religion versus freedom of expression, a complicated case that reasonable people could disagree about.
Alan, I want to go back to the union decision that we brought up because we've got a major rulings that were decided within the past few days, but I want to go to that union decision overturning that ruling from 1977. Are you surprised at all by the court's decision, and do you agree with it?
I'm not surprised. I think it's a decision that will mark the increasing irrelevance of labor unions in America. Unions are becoming far less important than they used to be. The interesting thing, of course, is that many, many labor union members voted for President Trump. And so this might be a decision that many of them object to. After all, unions do collectively bargain for all of their members. And the argument on the other side was that people who don't want to contribute are getting a free ride. They're getting the benefit of collective bargaining, increased wages, better working conditions, but they're not willing to pay the dues. On the other side is the argument, well, we're willing to pay the dues, but not to use them for political views that we disagree with. So, you know, this is part and parcel of a developing issue when it comes to taxation. People don't want to pay for abortion, taxes to go to abortion. When I was a young man, people didn't want to pay their taxes to go to fighting the Vietnam War. And, you know, it's a very complex question. When you live in a complex society, what you have to contribute to if you disagree with what your union, your corporation, or your government is doing. Not easy.
Well, among those complexities, Professor, you mentioned the politicization of the courts that we're seeing in these 5-4 decisions continually, which may change somewhat with the retirement of Justice Kennedy. But can this politicization, this sort of, I think you mentioned decreased respect, really, for the Supreme Court be turned? And if it isn't turned, what is the ramification on constitutional law?
Well, I think the Supreme Court has been called by the Federalist Papers the least dangerous branch because it has neither the sword nor the purse to enforce its judgments, just the credibility of its justices. And I think when we see that diminished, it will hurt. For example, when the Supreme Court desegregated the schools, Brown versus Board of Education, it was a 9-0 decision. And indeed, the court waited until they were certain to have 9-0 before they rendered the decision. If they had rendered a 5-4 decision, desegregating schools, I'm not sure schools would have been desegregated. I think we would have seen a lot of lawlessness. We saw plenty of lawlessness anyway, but at least you had a united Supreme Court standing behind it. Bush versus Gore was 5-4 on complete party lines, and a lot of people didn't respect that decision. It was called a self-inflicted wound on the Supreme Court. So I'm hoping that some of the justices see their role as statesmen and stateswomen more than they do as politically aligned with one party or another. But I think that's unlikely to happen. I think we're going to see increased politicization of the court. President Trump could end it if he appointed a very distinguished justice who didn't necessarily follow all of his conservative ideologies. But of course, his base wouldn't accept that. The base wants a very conservative justice.
Now, Professor, let's switch gears and talk about the fallout from another Supreme Court ruling. And of course, that's the court's decision to uphold the president's travel ban. Predictably, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell praised the ruling. Let's listen to Senator McConnell.
There were several earlier iterations of the so-called travel ban. I think the administration finally got it right. The Supreme Court agreed with that. And I think this is a decision the president should feel good about, and I'm comfortable with, even though I didn't care for the earlier version.
But New Jersey Senator Cory Booker predictably slammed the ruling.
We need to reclaim our values, and I'm not saying it's not partisan values. It's not Democrat or Republican. We're a good nation. We're good people, and we should be setting a standard on this planet of what humanity should be about.
The ban restricts entry from 7 countries to varying degrees. Those countries include Iran, North Korea, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and Somalia and Venezuela. The court held that the ban's challengers, Professor, failed to show how it violates immigration law or the Constitution's First Amendment that prohibits the government from favoring one religion over another. So did the court get this right? And if so, why did the left-leaning faction of the court stand firm on party lines? Many felt this was a more clear-cut case than the union case.
Well, I thought it was a more clear-cut case myself. I'm strongly opposed to the travel ban on political grounds. I don't think we should be banning country by country. I think we should be banning individuals. There are very good people in Iran and other places who would make great people. There are exceptions, and some of them can come, and many, in fact, Iranians are already studying in American institutions. But I don't like country by country banning. But that's my personal view. As a matter of constitutionality, I'm a liberal and I'm a Democrat, but I think if I had been on the Supreme Court, I would have sided with the majority on this one. I think there's a big difference between opposing something on political grounds and finding a constitutional violation. I find it difficult to articulate a constitutional violation here. The ban was not directed against all Muslim countries. In fact, only a small percentage of Muslims are affected. Right. Indonesia, Pakistan, they're not affected. And not all the countries on the list are Muslim. North Korea, Venezuela, obviously, are not. So I don't think you can find
an executive order to end the policy last week. As you know, more than 2,300 migrant children were separated from their parents after the Trump administration began that zero tolerance policy in early May. Meanwhile, 17 states are also suing the Trump administration to end the policy, and all 17 of them are led by Democrat attorneys in general. So the New Jersey Attorney General says that the administration's practice of separating families is cruel, plain and simple, and that every day it seems like the administration is issuing new contradictory policies and relying on new contradictory justifications. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I don't like separating families at the border, and I do think that our system of checks and balances is working. Most Americans didn't like it. They let the president know about it. The president signed an order changing that policy, at least prospectively. I support the court's decision saying you have to reunite families now that have been held apart. We should secure our borders, but I don't think we should be holding children and parents as hostages to the failure of the government to adopt a reasonable immigration policy. We have to get Congress to work and to adopt a reasonable immigration policy, the president to sign it, but I don't think it should include separating parents from children at the border. And I think that most Americans understand that, and I suspect that's why President Trump, at least prospectively, changed that policy.
All right. Alan Dershowitz, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Professor.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Newsmax TV. Watch us on Dish, DirecTV, AT&T Uverse, Verizon Fios, or download our free app. Don't have Newsmax TV? Call your local cable provider and request Newsmax today.